Ever since I can remember anything, about 3 years of age, I wanted to fly. I remember saying, "Dad, I'm going to fly those. I'm going to fly when I grow up."
The day would come when America would be glad little girls became women pilots. Pearl Harbor is invaded, and the United States enters World War II. Everyone has to pitch in on the home front. Girlfriends, sisters, wives, all fill jobs left by men gone to war. Roles are changing, and women volunteer to meet every wartime demand.
We did something for our country because in those days, women were doing everything to advance the cause of the war. I mean, if you were not working in the Red Cross, making bandages, or Rosie the Riveter, you were doing something, and this was wonderful to do this for your country and do something that you loved.
One of the most dramatic changes is the formation of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the W.A.S.Ps. For the first time in history, America would see women in the cockpits of military aircraft. The W.A.S.P had two objectives. First, support the air effort at home, releasing male pilots for combat duty.
The second reason for the conception of the W.A.S.P was experimental. Could women fly? Well, as for me, I never got in an aircraft yet that asked what sex I was. If you knew how to fly, you flew. As simple as that.
The message from the White House was clear.
To some generations, much is given. Of other generations, much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny.
Destiny had called, and women would answer. Working on the home front, these pioneer pilots flew every American aircraft made. From the fastest fighters to the biggest bombers. As with all wars, there were prices to pay. Heroism and danger would no longer be reserved exclusively for men.
The W.A.S.P program began as a vision of Jacqueline Cochran, the contemporary of Amelia Earhart. Jackie gained national recognition as an air speed racer, and in 1938 won the prestigious Bendix Transcontinental Race. These achievements received attention from the White House, and Jackie was invited to meet the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. She made the most of this opportunity and presented Mrs. Roosevelt with an outline for using women in military aviation in the event of war. Her idea was that women could be trained to fill any position in the military air service. It would take time for the idea and the need to merge. The year was 1939.
The need, however, already existed in England, where Hitler's bombing raids were taking a devastating toll. The British started using women pilots to ferry aircraft in their Air Transport Auxiliary Service, or ATA. Jackie traveled abroad to observe this unique English group, which included several American volunteers.
Some of us stayed through the entire war. We were helpers for the Royal Air Force. Our main job was to ferry new aircraft from the factories directly to the squadrons.
Back home in America, an elite group of women pilots was being organized by Nancy Love. Nancy had a deep affection for aviation. At 17, she flew charter planes to help pay for college. Later, she joined the Air Transport Command. It was here that her idea would come to life. Nancy's opinion differed from Jackie's in that she believed that only highly experienced female pilots should fly military aircraft, and then only to ferry them.
The W.A.S.P program actually began in September of 1942, and it was started by Nancy Love, who very quietly organized the group of women pilots into the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, which was an experiment to use women who were already trained.
The initial goal of the program was to recruit 25 female pilots. Prerequisites to enter the program were strict. Pilots must be high school graduates, possessing a private license with 500 hours flying time and a minimum rating of 200 horsepower. Many pilots came from the civilian pilot training program created by the government before the war.
One of her volunteers was Cornelia Fort, who was a flying instructor in Hawaii. On Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, she was flying with a student near John Rogers Airport near Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, Cornelia noticed a Japanese fighter closing in on her small civilian plane. Looking back toward the harbor, she saw billowing black smoke, and her spine tingled at the horrible sight. With a 0 above and 2 below, she took evasive action in a hail of gunfire. She and the student narrowly escaped death on a day that would live forever in infamy. Cornelia had logged 845 hours before she was accepted as the second pilot in the W.A.S.P program.
The program began with a dozen pilots at Newcastle Air Base in Wilmington, Delaware. It would take some time to reach the goal of 25. Nancy continued sending telegrams recruiting qualified pilots. This effort brought Evelyn Sharp from Ord, Nebraska into the program. Evelyn was the most experienced pilot. She had logged 2,950 hours as a barnstormer and instructor. Evelyn was the first woman to ever earn a transport pilot license. Barbara Erickson London, a friend of Cornelia Fort and Evelyn Sharp, also joined the program.
From that point on, we had about 2 weeks training and 2 weeks ground school. They taught us how to march. We didn't have to salute. And how to fly the airplane and how to do it the Army way.
The W.A.S.P.'s responsibility in ferrying aircraft was quickly taking form. Pilot Florine Miller remembers.
Our job was to take the planes from the factories and to the airfields to the overseas shipping points and wherever the planes happened to be needed. So we were running them around the country and everything without the help of radar, navigation by sticking your head out the window and looking down the ground, seeing what you could see and hoping you got the wind direction right.
Danger was a constant reality for pilots working on the home front, as well as for those in battle. On March 21st, 1943, Cornelia Fort, Pearl Harbor survivor, was the first W.A.S.P. to die on active duty.
She was killed in a midair out almost over Sweetwater on one of her first ferry flights. And she was ferrying, and there was another boy ferrying another BT, and he came too close and clipped her wing. And she went in, and he went on to the next stop.
The loss was deeply felt, but their mission had to continue.
Jackie Cochran completed her observation in England of the Air Transport Auxiliary and returned to America. She was now more convinced that the role of American women pilots could be expanded. Jackie believed that if properly trained, these women could relieve male pilots in more areas than strictly ferrying aircraft. She proposed that these pilots wouldn't need the extensive hours required by the W.A.S.P. This would result in more pilots becoming available. They could be trained for test flights, target towing, bombers, or any other kind of military duty.
The battles were increasing in fury on both fronts. The Japanese were still scoring significant victories in the Pacific. And Hitler's forces were formidable. The Nazis were developing new technologies, including the V-2 rockets to destroy the Allies. Jackie pitched her plan for expanding women's services to General Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces. Arnold agreed and gave Jackie orders to begin training for a new expanded program, the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or the W.A.S.P. Nancy Love's successful W.A.S.P. program was later incorporated into the W.A.S.Ps. Nancy continued to lead the ferrying division, and Jackie Cochran became the new director.
The continuation of the whole program depended on the success of the first class in training.
There was a memo out saying, get rid of these women as quickly as possible. We know they cannot fly military aircraft, but we must give them the opportunity.
We were the guinea pigs. In fact, we were told that if we made it, there would be further classes. If we didn't make it and couldn't pass all the tests and requirements necessary, the whole program would fail. Needless to say, we did our best and we succeeded.
So they didn't get rid of us in a hurry. In fact, they didn't get rid of us at all.
The first training base was at Houston Municipal Airport.
We did not have uniforms. We were in just our clothing, all different colors. There was no standard dress whatsoever. At first, we just flew commercial aircraft down there. They didn't have any Army aircraft in there for training.
The program continued to expand. There were not enough barracks or facilities to hold the number of trainees on the way. Avenger Field, not far from Sweetwater, Texas, was chosen as the additional training base. The contractor, Aviation Enterprises, built the base to handle approximately 500 trainees, and it was filled to capacity the entire time it was open. The official insignia for the W.A.S.P. was a special cartoon character named Fifinella, or Fifi, after a mythological gremlin of the air. Fifi was designed by Walt Disney and supposed to bring all the W.A.S.P. pilots good luck.
Well, Fifi is a good little gremlin. She saw to it that we got home safely on every flight.
We were soon learning to march. We were soon learning to meet formation. And that first day was a real past experience because we were no longer civilians.
Since the women were flying military planes and doing military work, the obvious choice was to go the military way. The rules made for the W.A.S.P. included no dating civilian, military, or instructional personnel.
People often ask, what about your love life? Well, we were not allowed to date instructors. That was grounds for dismissal, instant dismissal. Most of the gals did manage, so yes, we did have a romance here and there, but we did it discreetly.
And no consumption of alcohol on or off the base.
There was one mechanic at Avenger, and if they'd ever found out about him, he would have been fired on the spot. He carried a flask, and every time a girl came down close to tears, he'd know what had happened. And he'd say, here, have a little of this, it'll make you feel better.
But rules were made to be broken. If the men in the military couldn't perform their tasks, they were moved to other duty areas. A W.A.S.P., on the other hand, was given an immediate and permanent release.
We were only allowed so many demerits, 70. And if you got more than 70 demerits, you were dismissed. And unlike the male cadets, they could walk them off. We couldn't. A buddy of mine in my class was 2 weeks from graduation, and she was on a solo cross country, and she got lost. And we were always told if we had to set down the 6 to always land gear up. Well, she covered the field and figured she could land gear down, which she did, and didn't put a scratch on the airplane. But because she got lost and because she broke the rule, she was washed out of the program 2 weeks before graduation. It upset her so emotionally that she was bent on committing suicide. And they called me in the middle of the night and said, she's up on the platform where LaRue used to give us our exercises. And so I went up and calmed her down. She was going to take an airplane and just drive it into the ground. So I convinced her that I'm sure she could fly very well. She just couldn't fly to please the Army.
The trainees did not receive special treatment just because they were women. The W.A.S.P. went through the same program as the male cadets. 12-hour days were not uncommon, starting early with strenuous calisthenics and ending with rigorous military classes and flight training.
We had a sergeant that gave us physical training. And as one of them told me as I was jogging around the gym, this will make a man out of you, as I was huffing. And I explained to him I wasn't interested in becoming one.
Grace Burge Mayfield, the little girl who dreamed of flying planes, got her wish and joined the class that graduated in March of 1943.
There were 78 girls who started in my class, which was the third class to go in W.A.S.P training, and only 38 of us were graduated.
The flight instructors possessed a great deal of power over the W.A.S.P trainees.
Some of the instructors were very helpful. Others didn't really believe in the program, and they were not helpful.
I remember being worried about the test hops and things, particularly one because one of the instructors was asking me for dates, and we weren't supposed to fraternize with our instructors, and I didn't want to anyway. And I drew him as a check pilot for one of my check rides, and I thought then I probably would flunk.
I had quite an experience with one instructor. He was the kind who wasn't going to tell you anything, yes, no, or go to hell, nothing. You were just going to sit there and fly. And so we went up. We were supposed to do spins that day. I'd never flown with him before. But I soon found out that he really was sloppy on the controls. He was very heavy on the rudders. I had over 300 hours. And I had done some instructing. And up we went. And this fellow, we got up and he went into a spin. He did that fine, but he pulled it up again with the nose so high that it scared me. So I yelled at him. I said, "What are you doing? You're going to go into a secondary spin." He said, "What do you know?" Well, you know, he was the instructor. So he pulled it up. We went into another spin, and he did go into a secondary spin. Now, when you go into a secondary spin, the aircraft, that would have a tendency to go over onto its back, so that the tail would be forward of the engine in a vertical plane. Terrible. And he froze. And I got pumped full of adrenaline, and it took all the strength I had to break it loose. And we came down, we pulled out, far too close to the ground. Never said a word to him. He never said a word to me. He didn't touch the controls again. We flew back to Houston and got out, and he went in and quit. And it's a good thing, too, because he would have killed somebody. But for one joker like that, there were dozens who were fine men indeed.
Word traveled quickly that there were beautiful women pilots at Avenger Field. Within the first week, there just happened to be 100 emergency landings by male pilots. This activity was quickly stopped by orders from above, much to everyone's dismay. During ground school, pilots were taught to read maps and charts, understand weather theory, practice radio terminology, and plenty of Morse code. There were enough dits and dots to make them dizzy.
Many long hours of training were spent in the link flight simulators. Pilots used these strange-looking devices to practice flying blind, using instruments only. When pilots completed instrument training, they would be able to fly under almost any conditions.
We checked the weather, and they said it was clear, so we took off, and we ended up at our destination, and it was socked in. It was also socked in at the alternate, and it was socked in everywhere, so we had to go down on instruments. And this was a B-26 base. And that was the first time I had actually done actual instrument flying. That is, I either had to do what I had been taught to do, or I wasn't going to get done.
Instructors were required to accompany W.A.S.P on a number of their test flights. After each pilot's first solo, there was a special W.A.S.P celebration.
We all cheered whenever anyone soloed. We had what was called a wishing well, and that was anytime a girl soloed, we ran to the wishing well and dumped her in the water.
During training, pilots often flew the planes upside down.
The seat belts were put in so miserably that if you put any pressure on them, they would break. There's one wonderful story about an instructor who looked back after they were inverted, looked back at his student. She was hanging on like this, you see, and he got her back in. Now, how he ever did that, I don't know, but he did. He turned slowly so that she didn't fall off and got her back in the cockpit.
After months of training and hours of flying, each class looked forward to graduation day and receiving the silver wings of the W.A.S.P.
I'll never forget when graduation day came. I couldn't believe it when I told my father that I was going to go into this training. He said, "Well, Grace, I've always thought you had good judgment. From the time you were 3 years old, you showed good judgment. But this time, I think you're a damn fool. So anyway, on the day of graduation, about an hour before we were to get our wings, I had this special delivery telegram from my father. Oh boy. He said, you talked of fear of failure, but I knew you wouldn't fail. You've never failed at anything. Oh, that was a highlight.
From this point, the W.A.S.P were assigned to over 130 bases throughout the United States. More than 25,000 women had applied to become W.A.S.P. Of these, just over 1,800 were accepted, and only 1,104 were graduated. They represented America's very best.
We had one girl in our class got word that her husband was a P-47 pilot, and he was shot down. And I think she mourned for about 2 hours. Of course, I know in her heart she mourned a lot longer than that. But at the end of about 2 hours, she was back on the flight line. These gals got a lot of grit. They got a lot of gumption. You know, they got a lot of what it takes.
The W.A.S.Ps were now on the job. The task at hand was enormous, but the women pilots were up for the challenge. Performing their jobs unselfishly, they completed each mission with unbounded pride.
They were doing something they loved flying. They were serving their country at a time of critical need. We didn't think about the fact that we were playing role models until it was all over. But now that we look back on it, we're all glad we did.
The Nazi invasion of Russia had decimated the Soviet Air Force. As our allies, they desperately needed fighter planes. The W.A.S.P helped meet this international need.
We picked up P-39s and P-63s in Buffalo that went to the Russians, and we took those to Great Falls.
I did meet one Russian girl pilot, and she could speak very little English, but all she wanted to know was, where's the push-push? Where's the push-push? And Russian girl pilots came over to Fairbanks, Alaska, and flew them across the sea. In fact, I had the red Russian star on all those P-39s. We called it the Texaco sign. And people often ask me if I were a Russian pilot, and I said, no, not really.
The Russian women always amused us when we'd see them take off because they knew two positions for the throttle, all the way closed or all the way open.
Oh, I think they had to be noble and courageous, because they didn't have some of the equipment that our girls had. And they flew the P-39s in combat. One of them was 5 months pregnant when she flew in combat.
A young American pilot came up to me, he said, have you seen those Russian women? Well, of course I had. He said, do you know what? They brought those P-63s. They're going to fly those P-63s to Russia. It made me so mad. I said, who the hell do you think flew them up here in the first place?
Another duty of the W.A.S.P was to deliver war-weary planes that should have been sent by rail to the junkyard. Old tires would suddenly blow out on takeoff, and low-octane fuel could cause a fatal stall. But the danger wasn't limited to old planes. W.A.S.Ps also picked up airplanes at the factories for delivery. Quite often, it was the plane's first flight.
We were officially known as engineering test pilots. We had to check out any planes that had had any major overhaul work before they would let the men fly them. The women had to test them first.
A seasoned pilot knew to double-check all controls and confirm that they were assembled properly.
I went through the factory with a group, and I watched one of the Rosie the Riveters on the line, and she looked around. She popped a rivet on the wing. And she looked around, and all of a sudden, she put a piece of gum from her mouth in the rivet hole. Now, this might explain why it was that occasionally we were flying planes and the wingtips would fall off.
I took an AT-6 up to 11,000 feet to check the spin characteristics. It had just been repaired by some trainee mechanics. And they hooked all the controls up backwards, and I didn't catch it. I pulled out at about 500 feet.
Evelyn Sharp, the pilot who had logged the most number of hours before joining the program, met an untimely death. Her hometown was so moved that they provided a special memorial and named the municipal airport after her.
When a girl died, there were no death benefits. In one case that I know of, was for Evelyn Sharp, we took up a collection and helped get her body back home.
Despite their heroic efforts, many of the W.A.S.P. found trust and acceptance hard to come by.
A man from the old Army Air Corps' financial end in Congress called up and he said, "Get those women out of my airplane."
We were sent to Mesa, 20 of us, when we graduated from training. And there was one squadron of girls, 2 squadron of white males, and 1 squadron of black males. And when the course was over, we went through B-25, regular B-25 course. They ran all of us through any kind of test they could figure. And the girls came out on top on instruments.
Per squadron, per girl, we probably delivered more airplanes over a longer distance than the boys did. And the girls were very, very busy. They were very conscientious.
A woman couldn't fly a B-24 as first pilot because it had a booster on all the controls. That is, it had extra power that was used to help you fly it. And if the booster went out, then the controls were so heavy that they said that a woman could not handle it, which I don't think is true because my pilot was half my size. And I'm sure that I could have held it as well as he could.
Our situation was that we felt we had to do better than they did because they were in because they had to be, but we were in because we loved flying.
We were assigned 6 to a room, and a lot of us had thought that was going to be a horrible experience, living with no privacy with 5 other girls. Well, very shortly, we became very good friends, and it was no problem at all. We learned to share and also learned to help each other as much as possible. And we just became a well-bonded group.
We were a sisterhood, and sisters get together. And we had experiences that no one else had, and it was kind of fun to relive them.
The women pilots were making their presence known. No plane could intimidate them. Determination and the love of flying kept these women going.
I flew everything from a Piper Cub up to a co-pilot in the B-24. And it was a wonderful life. You never knew whether you were going to be in New York or Chicago.
At one time, I had 36 airplanes listed on my qualification card as having been checked out. I would say that the average girl, or for myself, were probably current in 10 or 12 different kinds of airplanes at one point in time. So when you got up in the morning and went down to pick up your orders, you didn't have any idea what kind of an airplane you might be taking that day, or whether you might be going to Sacramento, or whether you might be going to Newark, or whether you'd have a B-17 or a P-51.
The B-17 is the most beautiful aircraft ever built, as far as I'm concerned. It's stable, it's wonderful, it survived tremendous damage in World War II in combat. And so, even though you might feather an engine, I've been on board where there's a small engine fire and that's snuffed out quickly. I've been through ice where the ice is built up on the propeller and then it's slashed off into the fuselage and you hear these crackling noises. I've seen the St. Elmo's fire, but my goodness, you always came home. It was, you could come home on 3 engines, and it was nothing.
W.A.S.P. were even asked to check out on the B-29 Superfortress by Colonel Paul Tibbets, who went on to fly the first mission to carry the atomic bomb.
Since that was the biggest thing in the inventory at the time, this was kind of overwhelming. His idea was to show it was a very safe aircraft. They'd had a little problem with it in fires, and some of their men didn't want to fly. The attitude was, if a woman can do it, any idiot can do it. And someone said to me once, "That's demeaning." I said, "No, it isn't. Not when they're letting you fly their very best piece of equipment. They can say what they want to. If I can check out," and I did.
Bombing missions were important to the U.S. military strategy. Hitler's European fortress was now vulnerable, but our men had to be quickly trained to hit their targets. W.A.S.P began piloting the planes in practice runs for training bombardiers.
They had to fly like a bomber pilot, which meant that they took it to within a certain distance from the bombing target, then turned the plane over to the bombardier pilot, who sat in the back and navigated the plane from there on in over the target. They used live bombs. These were women carrying live bombs. One of the women was flying a plane carrying bombs, and they hung up in the bomb rack. And she could not dislodge them, even to the extent of a man opening the bomb bay door and trying to dislodge it with his foot. God knows that took courage. But they were not able to just do that. So she landed with the bomb still hanging on the rack. Cool, calm, and collected. She just did it. She didn't think anything of it.
An equally important duty of the W.A.S.P was helping young gunnery recruits practice their aim. The pilots would tow a target just 30 yards behind their plane. Sometimes the plane itself became a mistaken target, and high-caliber bullets would tear holes in the fuselage. Through it all, the W.A.S.Ps remained calm.
Towing targets was quite an interesting experience. The artillerymen that were shooting at the target frequently missed the target, and we came down with holes in the plane, which was exciting to say the least.
We had some trying experiences when we were flying B-26s. They were not equipped for women, as you could imagine. And I was up for 8 straight hours on 2 tow target missions, which can be a strain.
Despite the long hours and hard work, the women still had time to be feminine and fall in love.
Learn very soon that if you leave the base in a bomber and you take a few things that you'd really like to have, you may have to throw them out the window, because they'll, as soon as you deliver this bomber to New York, they'll put you in a single-engine fighter and you can't get your stuff in there. We learned that fast, and we lost a few things that way. I always liked to turn into a girl every chance I could, so I would put a shoe in one of the ammunition boxes that were out on the wings. And each little place, I'd carry a Phillips screwdriver in my pocket, unscrew the lid, pull it out, put a shoe in that, do it down, go put another shoe over here, put another skirt over here, and what have you. The cockpit really small. You could have a little old bag about so tall, about so long, and that's it. You know, a toothbrush and a clean shirt, just about the size of what you could get in there. The guys always kidded me. They'd always say, boy, I tell you that, Florine, she takes more time trying to get out of her airplane than she does trying to fly from point A to point B.
We had a social life. In fact, you know, everybody at 21 and 22 were gorgeous. The guys were gorgeous. The girls were gorgeous. But the problem is, what you have to realize, we were gone most of the time. We had dates when we were home. We went to the movies. We went to the Post Theater. We went out to the Officers Club for dinner. But most of the time, we were on call the following morning. If we were home, we were on call the following morning for a ferry trip. And he was on call the same way, unless he was an administrative officer. So we had to chase him across the country if we wanted to find him lots of times.
One of the girls had married a Navy officer while she was there. She got married in, I think, Greenville, Texas, someplace. Anyway, several of us went down and, of course, painted the airplane with lipsticks. He had flown in from Washington with a nice little, it was a Beechcraft, I think it was. And it had a crew chief who later wanted to know what kind of lipstick we used because the plane, he had a devil of a time getting off just married. And then they kidded us about defacing government property and had us worried about that for a long time.
America's attention was centered overseas. Most of the general public wasn't aware of the W.A.S.P's role in the war effort.
One of the most embarrassing things is trying to explain to people who you are in this uniform. They ask you whether you're a truck driver, or whether you deliver the morning milk, or you drive a school bus.
They thought we were something else, movie attendants or ushers or something. We'd try to tell, but they didn't believe that we flew. They thought we were in the Air Force, maybe serving coffee or something like that.
We were grounded in Oklahoma City, and I had my flying slacks on, and we tried to go into a nightclub and a dining room, and they wouldn't allow me because they said they did not allow women in slacks. And I tried to tell them that I was in uniform, but I didn't. And another thing was funny that happened. We were on the train coming back from a flight. There were men and women, and they held the train for us in Chicago so we could go on to Romulus, Detroit. And when we got there, we had our parachutes and everything. Well, they wouldn't let us on the train because they thought that we were girls that the boys had picked up on the way. And it took us quite a while to convince them that, no, we were part of the flight of men and women that were ferrying airplanes, and that we should be allowed on the train.
The pursuits were so badly needed that the ferry pilot had what we called a number 2 priority on the airlines. Our pass and ticket on the airline, the only person that could kick us off of a seat on the airline was the President of the United States. If we had to get home after delivering an airplane, we could bump anybody on the airline, including senators, assemblymen, congressmen, cabinet members, anybody, because a ferry pilot had the first priority, second priority behind the President to get home. We were that badly needed.
When you delivered a plane and they signed for it, and you knew that you had flown all across the United States, or I mean at least the worst part of the United States, it was a great feeling.
A good pilot had to always be prepared for the unexpected.
We took off in Tucson, and it was so hot, it was summertime, and the oil temperature went up, and we couldn't get above about 1,000 feet off the ground, and we were roasting. And so we both took our shirts off. We were flying within sight of each other, and I suddenly saw a flick of what I thought was silver out of the corner of my eye to the left of me. And I looked over there, and there was a male pilot grinning. And I can still see his black mustache. I never knew which one he was in Long Beach because we had 2,000 men pilots there. But I used to look at all of them wondering which one it was. But we did a lot of aerobatics, getting our shirts back on and everything, and then he just poured the power on and left us.
I was flying out to Washington, D.C. to meet a boyfriend, and this gal and I had the airplane checked out to us. And while we were flying across West Virginia or someplace, the airplane started smoking and vibrating. So we turned around and made an emergency landing. Well, she thought that we were running out of runway and put the brakes on. And we went over on our back. But neither one of us are hurt. The only time I got hurt was when I kicked the airplane because I didn't get to go to see my boyfriend.
I was flying a P-47, and we were using the shortest runway we had there at Dallas, a runway that we very infrequently used, that we didn't like. It had obstructions all across the back end of it. There were houses, there were high lines. So I was coming on my final to come in to put it down, and all of a sudden, crash. And I had hit the top of a great big high line. And this big crunch and screaming loud noise threw the plane up and started to roll it on its back. Now, I had had acrobatic training, so I instinctively crossed controls, threw on the power, and so forth, and got the thing unrolled and heading right into a hangar. I could see that hangar yet with the big open doors, and I thought, shall I go in it or shall I try to go over it? And because I knew I was heading right to it, and the only way to stop, couldn't land or anything else. So I decided I'd try to go over it, so put, put, put. And sure enough, I barely got over it. Well, I had knocked all the lights out of the airport. Wasn't a stinking light anywhere. And so, in the meantime now, I have just on this frantic on the radio. Who's going to talk to me? Well, finally, somebody answered me, and I told him, get some cars and put the lights down at the end of the runway and shine the lights on the runway. I can't tell where I'm going. Besides, there are so many lights all around this airport. There's traffic. And so the police got out there and stopped all the cars and had them turn the lights off. In the meantime, all this information gets on radio and everything else, I guess. So I have everybody out looking. In those days, we didn't have many crashes, so that was a big deal, you know, see and hear of a crash, and certainly a fighter plane. But I decided, okay, I'll try to come in. Came in and made a decent landing. I pulled back just about a quarter of that throttle, and the thing just boom, down on that ground. As I turned the corner toward the hangar, I could see like hundreds of people out there. I thought, oh no, now I'm not only scared, I'm embarrassed. And I got off of that wing, didn't break my neck. Meantime, the maintenance man's going around, and he looked at the propeller, and you know, the language they use sometimes is, oh my blah blah, you know, and I thought, what in the world does he see that's exciting him like that? Well, about this much of one of the four blades was gone, had been melted off.
If you could think of anything melting that fast, hitting that high line that I hit, it's a wonder I wasn't electrocuted. But it melted that thing. No wonder the panel was going like this the whole time. Then he walked around and saw part of the wing gone. Well, blah, blah, blah. And a bunch of men started eventually coming around. Well, you should have heard all the comment and all the tail torn off. Then the maintenance man got on the inside of the airplane, and he stepped into, you know, to sit down and all. And what happened? Fell right through the floor. Fell through the floor. There was nothing but like a little piece of cardboard there between me and the ground all the time. And the airplane had been ripped open from the nose to the tail, just like a can opener. The tail wheel was there, see, so that was great. I had every control that I needed. But right from the engine nacelle, clear back to the tail wheel was just like a can opener. Had just ripped it open. And he just fell right through. And I said, well, that's all I would have needed. If I'd seen the air down there, I thought, I got to get out of here, you know.
We had a lot of songs. We really sang, and Cochran wanted us to sing, so we always sang every time she came. Let's see, blood on the cockpit, blood on the ground, big bloody puddles spread all around. Pity the pilot lying in the gore, she ain't gonna fly the pattern no more. Then it goes on, gory, gory, what a hell of a mess she made. Gory, gory, what a hell of a mess she made. Then gory, gory, what a hell of a mess she made. She really should have jumped.
There was a day when the men were not allowed to fly because the weather was too bad. But the W.A.S.P flew. Sometimes they would ask the commanding officers, why do we have to fly if the men are not flying? And they would say, well, you're expendable. We were. The men who were going into combat eventually were not expendable. If they were going to lose their lives, it would be in combat.
Marie Michelle Robinson had the W.A.S.P spirit and loved to fly. She had just gotten married and planned to tell her friends about the wonderful event after she completed a flight in a B-25. Marie never got the chance. Her plane crashed. She died at age 19. Her closest friend and classmate, Elizabeth McKeithen McGidd, was devastated. While completing her test flying duties for the day, she soared upward and thought of her friend. She was inspired to write a tribute to all W.A.S.Ps who had perished.
She is not dead, but only flying higher, higher than she's flown before, and earthly limitations will hinder her no more. There is no service ceiling or any fuel range, and there is no anoxia or need for engine change. Thank God that now her flight can be to heights her eyes had scanned, where she can race with comets and buzz the rainbow span. For she is universal like courage, love, and hope, and all free, sweet emotions of vast and godly scope. And understand, a pilot's fate is not the thing she fears, but rather sadness left behind, your heartbreak and your tears. So all you loved ones, dry your eyes. Yes, it is wrong that you should grieve, but she would love you more. And she would want you to believe she is not dead. You should have known that she is only flying higher, higher than she's ever flown.
A W.A.S.P death was different because there was no official recognition and few benefits. Men in the service received a $10,000 insurance policy, paid travel home, casket, and full military honors. A flag was provided to place over their casket, and the family was allowed to display the gold star in their home. Women Air Force service pilots received none of these honors or considerations. A mother once said to a W.A.S.P escort, "It's like all the government said is, thanks, here's your daughter back."
Of those who were killed, their families were not allowed to have the gold star displayed in their windows. They did not receive any death benefits. I wish that some things were retroactive so that these women and what they did could be fully acknowledged. Let me think a minute. They never were.
The accomplishments of the W.A.S.P were numerous. They logged 60 million miles and flew 80% of all ferry missions during the war.
They flew so many different kinds of airplanes and flew them so well, so safely. with a very low accident and fatality record.
It was great to be feeling like you were accomplishing something that hadn't been done before by women, and have a lot of fun doing it.
Well, wherever you looked, the 1,100 women pilots who were in the service were flying. No matter what job was given to them, they did it. They towed targets. They trained on instruments. They flew return combat veterans who had to be reoriented to smaller aircraft. They did it, everything you could name, and they did it well.
I was awarded the Air Medal in July of 1944. It was in recognition of 4 transcontinental flights from coast to coast in 3 different kinds of airplanes, 2 fighters and 1 transport airplane. What it really proved was what the girls can do, and this was something that was very necessary at the time because we were in the process of trying to get militarization through, and this was very effective to show the general public and the military what the girls were capable of doing.
Despite these great accomplishments, the W.A.S.P program was ended.
It really took the heart out of a lot of us because we had looked forward to doing more than what we were doing. My grandfather was killed by Germans. One uncle was killed by Germans. And I couldn't understand why they were disbanding us while the war was still going on.
And to be dismissed, discharged, Christmas time, with no transportation. Some of them had transportation, most of us didn't. No discharge pay, nothing. Just be turned loose, not even thank you. Though some bases gave us reviews, that was all. It was, we were all heartsick.
I could either leave my 51 there or take it and deliver it to Newark and hop an airline back to Long Beach. We were being disbanded. And so I got in the plane, and I wasn't about to leave it there. I got out, I taxied out, and I was about 10th in line to take off. And the snow on both sides of the runway was about 10 feet high. And I sat there and got a little more nervous, and I knew there was ice on the runway in Columbus, which was my next stop. And I started to think about all the people that, in the last flights, people that made, like Amelia Earhart and Sir Charles Kingsford Smith, and people that said they were on their last flights, and it turned out to be. And I thought, no, I'm not going to go. So I just called the tower and told them I was aborting, turned around and taxied it back. And the ground crew came out, and they had heard the story. And we patted the plane, and I shed a few tears, and they hugged me a couple of times. And I walked away, knew I'd never be in one again. It was very sad.
When the orders came through that we were to be disbanded, all of us at Perrin Field received invitations from one of the main airlines to come and interview to be stewardess. Some of the girls laughed, others cried, and most of us just tore the letters up.
We left with a feeling that something we had done was wrong. That wasn't the case at all. It was a political thing.
When we were disbanded, we volunteered to the federal government to continue our job on a non-paying basis and volunteered our time to do it for free. And they said there was no way that they could do it through the civil service program and let us keep our jobs.
When the orders came through, we were devastated. Our colonel was incensed also because he liked us. He liked the job we were doing. And he said, well, when you girls leave this base, we're going to have a pass-in review for you. They had a pass-in review, and afterwards he gave us all the opportunity to choose the plane we wanted and the pilot we wanted to fly us home. And 4 of us, of course, chose the men we'd decided to marry, who flew us home and then brought the plane back.
The last class graduated just 13 days before the end of the W.A.S.P program. On graduation day, with courage and dignity, they sang a farewell song. The The W.A.S.P experience cannot be measured just by the number of planes flown or targets towed.
This was the best time of our life. We never had a period in our life that gave us what these 3 years gave us. We were at the right place at the right time. We were able to fly all of these marvelous airplanes. We were helping with a war that we were very serious about, and we were very concerned about our country. And this is a war in which everyone was involved. And this experience was probably the greatest experience in our lives for all of us.
Every time I flew at night, I would hear music. And I cannot describe why, but it was there in my ears. And it was only the engine and the wind, but it was gorgeous. And it was a wonderful experience. I wouldn't change it for the world.
I admire every W.A.S.P tremendously because they were pioneers. And I think if anybody met a W.A.S.P, they would agree with me.
I'm really tickled to death that there's women finally in the Air Force that are doing what we wanted to do.
Their spirit lives on in their hearts and inspires the dreams of others. Lieutenant Colonel Kelly Hamilton Barlow flew a tanker in Operation Desert Storm. She represents the new generation of women pilots in the U.S. Air Force.
I think the W.A.S.P are terrific. If it hadn't been for the W.A.S.P basically opening up the doors for flight to us, and I say us meaning all the women who have ever wanted to serve their country, I think that we wouldn't be where we are today. Their service during World War II was really special because it was an act of dedication and love of flying and love of country that made them come forward and serve.
I enjoyed every minute of it. I used to, especially in the fighters, I used to pinch myself and think, gee, this is way beyond your childhood dreams. You just thought you'd fly a puddle jumper or something. But flying one of these things from one end of the country to the other, I just couldn't believe it. Sometimes wondered if it was real.
His eyes bug out, the chances are he won't believe me. He'll go through the same darn things when he's grown up, no doubt, but he can't say I didn't warn him. What would happen when he met up with that city cat? Oh, darn you, going back to where I come from, where the mockingbird is singing in the lilac bush. I can do that.
To order a video cassette of Women of Courage, send $39.95 plus $2.50 shipping and handling and sales tax where applicable to the address on your screen or call 1-800-326-4223.
see how the United States and the Soviet Union came to the very edge of mutual destruction on
America fell in love with can be yours during McDonald's holiday